Great, thank you. Thank you for coming. Yep. Okay. So this is my attempt to give a bit of a more popular talk on the topic. I will speak a little bit about the studies that we have done in the lovely group of people whose name you see in the middle of a slide. But also we'll try to include some other results that would hopefully give a bit more comprehensive picture of this service. So very quickly about the demand responsive transport, DRT, or how we see it. So it is it provides trips on demand. So it's not like you can go to the bus stop and step into the open doors of a bus. Now you explicitly order a trip. The service somehow changes the schedule of the vehicle, so the trip is provided. And the trips are supposed to be shared, so multiple travelers in the same vehicle. A bit more details for today. We are focusing on the a bit modern vision of this concept, that we have a free-floating fleet of vehicles in some zone, and they serve the trips within that zone. Once again, trips are shared, so we envision it as a more of a public transport type of transport. And it's again, modern thing, it is open to general population, general public. Plus a small side note, in this context, shared autonomous vehicle, shared, not private, are essentially the DRT I want to talk about. I will touch three type of service design. Now it's envisioned in simulation studies. One popular big vision is when DRT becomes the main urban mode. It's like a futuristic vision where everything is your autonomous taxi, and it just drive you whatever you want. A more realistic scenario these days is replacing the rural bus lines, where driving big buses isn't very efficient. And finally, I'll talk about some sort of integration of DRT with public transport or into public transport. Okay, so we'll have to jump in directly because I want to talk about many things. And if you like charts and tables, you are getting a treat today. If not, well, I will try to make I try to make it as light as possible as I can. So first, let's try replacing. Again, the idea is that with low demand densities, big buses aren't inefficient. So with DRT, we can drive smaller vehicles when we need to drive the vehicles, when there is a demand. So this is our study that we done in Lolland in Denmark. It's a relatively rural area with 53 persons per square kilometer on the density side. We took about the half of it and define our DRT area where the vehicles separate, and according to scenario, removed all the red lines here completely and replaced them with DRT. The rest of public transport system is preserved how it was rather, includes like buses where some connections to our DRT is possible, and a big train line that connects major towns in that area. So here we are talking about stop-to-stop type of a service for DRT. Because we had the data for that, we get the data from the local bus operator, from the bus passenger counters. So now trips which started at where trips had started, certain stops where they ended somewhat. The goal here is to serve this demand as it was before in real life with DRT, with about the same trip quality. The restriction, it cannot be worse, for example, in a trip duration. It has to be at least as good as it was with buses. Again, we'll jump straight into the results to try to give some conclusion afterwards. So in all these charts, we have demand level on the x-axis, where the middle point is about the recorded situation in the year 2019. In the first chart, we see the cost per trip estimated, where orange lines are DRT buses, all estimated with different models, and blue lines, the chart for regular bus lines. So we can clearly see that buses kind of scales improve the costs much better than DRT service when we increase the demand. But still in the lower demand levels, DRT can even be more profitable than regular lines. That can be explained by the next chart, where we can see the number of vehicles that were needed to drive all these people. You know, in case of blue lines, or in case of buses can absorb, big buses can absorb extra trips without problems. Well, at this level, of course, they can. Well, will start to overflow at some point. But for DRT, there is quite a linear scaling with the demand. So the more demand you have, the more buses you will need. It similarly scales the number of vehicle kilometers traveled by those buses. That is depicted in those dotted orange lines. This thing. So DRTs here produce more vehicle kilometers than buses. Just kind of, from the first glance, is a bit unfortunate. But if we translate that in actual emissions, okay, I see what I'm doing wrong with the pointer. The last chart shows the emissions with the same color scheme. The DRT, as the vehicles are smaller, produce less emissions per kilometer, quite significantly less. So here we can achieve some improvement as well, which is nice. The second extra point, that kind of even out point between the two services happen at the larger demand densities if we are looking at the costs. So kind of immediate short conclusion from this, yeah, cost efficiency can be achieved, but in smaller demand zones, areas. And there is a potential environmental benefit in that as well. And we will jump straight away into the situations where we have DRT and traditional public transport at the same time. And those type of scenarios are almost exclusively studied within the urban big city environments. Let's look at the London case, at the small Greenwich zone of it, where in this blue line the DRT vehicles were operating. In this case, it was a free floating, like door-to-door shared taxi-like service, and the demand, oh my god, people are free to choose on which mode they are traveling based on their decision model. Where I want to say a side note, those decision choice model are a bit of crude and simple quite often. So that's probably not the numbers themselves that we should look at, but at the general trend. So again, we'll jump directly into the results. People had two scenarios. Well, in fact, more I want to tell about two scenarios here. One is more accessibility oriented. They had 4 seats minibuses with a relatively low fare similar to existing public transport, and then with more luxury, what they call convenience type of service with smaller vehicles and higher cost. So, as expected, the accessibility scenario attracts more people in this scenario, but again, numbers aren't, well, of course they are relevant, but it's more of a trend that we are looking at. So let's look at the other results, starting from the good results. There was a big shift from private cars to DRT in 50% to 6% in those two scenarios. That is good. That's what we typically want from public transport, if we look at this as public transport, to reduce the car usage. Because if, well, the reduced car usage brings other good consequences, like reducing the number of required parking slots, which dropped quite significantly for this zone to up to 38%. That's good. That kind of, in the second order effects, leads to potential better utilization of public spaces, which is nice. They somehow could achieve the reduction in the public transport travel times, which is nice. Although it's a bit unexpected to see the same effect in 2 nodes, but nonetheless. To the more of a negative side of the coin here, the vehicle kilometers, the total number produced by DRT and cars, increases quite a lot, up to 50% or 20% in those two scenarios, which together with it leads the, oh my god, increase in emissions, which is bad. That kind of can't be explained by we'll jump here to the last row, by the occupancy, by the number of people in the buses. So mean occupancy at the peak times even in this big accessibility scenario is quite low, it's 2.5. So vehicles are still highly underutilized, which leads to a lot of extra vehicle kilometers. And the last kind of negative effect is that the DRT here also compete with other public transport modes, with buses, and attracts quite a significant portion of that demand, which reduces the efficiency of that as well, which is Not very nice for public transport overall, probably. Down to the, in this, I want to show a bit of an extreme example, which is a simulation in Amsterdam, where again, now people are modeling the whole city. They have a fleet of door-to-door vehicles where people are free to choose according to the utility theory. The scenario here, people looked at where would car trips go if we just prohibit the cars? So this in a big colorful chart in the middle, we have C to the left, the kind of baseline scenario before any intervention. The split between modes to the right is when the cars are prohibited, and we have what people call right sourcing here, which is for me a DRT. And yes, DRT gets most of the car trips, can absorb that. But together with that, it absorbs a good half of walking, of bicycles, and public transport. So it's like putting the system in a direct competition with those modes. Maybe not the best way forward overall. Although this absorption of all cars has some potential, so that's need to be evaluated more and more. Yeah, short conclusion from that. Yes, we can reduce the number of vehicles on roads, which leads to less parking space required. That is good. That's what we can do, like in realistic scenarios, somewhat. But also in realistic scenarios, DRT does not reach this efficiency to reduce vehicle kilometers. In some works where, again, all the trips are thrown into DRT, people could achieve that. But in a smaller scenarios, no. Which leads me logically to the next step. Let's not compete with public transport. Let's supplement it so they work together. Okay, then moving towards first mile solution for DRT. That's again our study, or rather ongoing study in Sjöbo, in municipality of Sjöbo in Skåne. I suppose you know where it is better than I even. Because in this case, within the zone, we had DRT vehicles that could drive travelers directly. But when travelers want to go in a long distance trip away from the zone or into it, in fact, we provide a trip from door to bus. Not to a bus stop even, but to existing bus departure, so that the total trip quality of the whole trip is decent. Okay, here we kind of put a little bit finger in the air regarding the demand and fixed it to be somewhat like 10% of like total demand, which is kind of corresponds to the current split distribution for public transport, modal split distribution. And kind of important note that it's only the people who don't get a good bus connection currently. It's kind of and easy to do for us in simulation, but probably harder to realize in real life. But nonetheless, so we're comparing here DRT and cars, and throwing into about somewhat equal number of local shorter distance trips to 6,000 and longer distance trips to 0.4 thousands. So we needed 135 DRT, 8 seats DRT vehicles to drive that. And for the cars here is, well, just assume that 2 trips are served by 1 vehicle. But we will need it for the cost estimation later on. So now the magic happens. If we look at the total distance of direct trips, what car would drive, that's 95,000 kilometers. But if we look at what DRT should drive, like within the zone, that's only like 1/3 of it, a little bit less, 29,000 kilometers. So if we throw this into DRT again, we see a similar pattern that we increase the number of vehicle kilometers traveled. But the trick is that with this new service, we are serving only a small part of the trip. It's happening within the zone. The rest is kind of magically absorbed by existing public transport system. And so we assume that it comes for free for us for now, for this estimation. So that's quite almost a double of reduction in vehicle kilometers. That translates still in a bit slower, a bit lower reduction in the CO2 emissions. Again, because the car vehicles are smaller, DRT vehicles, well, kind of minivans, minibuses, still consume, produce more emissions per kilometer. And if we try to estimate the costs again, for DRT, it is kind of comparable to the costs of rural bus lines, cost per trip. For cars, this is the cost of owning a vehicle plus the depreciation and fuel costs. It's some numbers. If we follow the current trend and throwing out the drivers, maybe not the best phrasing of this idea, but essentially throw out the driver cost from the model, we will get quite a decent cost for operational cost for this service. So short conclusion here again, as a first mile solution, yeah, there is quite a good potential, but in this specific study, yes, the separation of demand is a bit questionable. So how to achieve something like that in reality. But it's overall rather an overlooked concept. It's it's either the first two options, either we're replacing something or just throwing the service in to compete with public transport So I will try to wrap up into larger conclusions with maybe a side note first. It is a very flexible the service in terms of how you want to build it. The design space is huge, and in fact, what we look today are just points in the big spectrum of what can be achieved. So we didn't touch the service strip quality really at all, unfortunately. And yeah, other organization of service. There is a lot of interesting stuff. So, and a lot of niches that the literature identifies for DRT. kind of focused on some specific demand or some specific type of trips, not kind of the whole population, as most of the kind of simulation studies are looking at. Okay, let's move on. Regarding the design, yes, the lower densities is where probably DRT niche is. In large scale, urban scenarios, there are a lot of questions. There are a lot of pros and cons. So it's hard to say too much here. Yes, and integration is probably better than competition. Finally, the thing that I didn't have time to speak today, that's, yeah, most of the services assume door-to-door trips, which also comes with an extra cost of navigating in a smaller areas and making multiple stops. More of a stop-to-stop, even with a relatively small distances between stop, is shown to be, in fact, more efficient. Again, because of the conglomeration of aggregation of demand to the same points. Okay. High vehicle utilization is a kind of weak point of this service. Even like a smaller 8-bus seats are very rarely utilized to its full. The stop-to-stop design helps with it a bit, kind of hint to which we didn't talk today. Regarding environmental impact, yes, in big urban scenarios, well, basically in most scenarios, we produce more vehicle kilometers than direct trips on the cars. So we want to achieve, want to reduce the environmental impact, going to work on ride sharing. But there are something to be said about, again, parking, a reduction of required space for the cars, that can lead to a second order effects of a better space utilization, in this case, in urban environment. Even, yes, in our small scenario in Sjöbo, show that there is a potential for emission reduction as well, against comparing to the cars even, which is great. And the last thing, if we compare like big buses and DRT vehicles, smaller vehicles benefit more from removal of drivers, from removing cost of drivers. So this is my talk for today. Thanks a lot for coming and listening, and I would be happy to hear your thoughts and answer your questions if you have them.
Yeah, thank you, Sergei. Open for questions and interesting comments. A reflection I have done since I heard you before talking about this is also that just the sustainability about the environment, it's also pro now. So you can, in my earlier employment at other public transport authorities, it have not just been now you also have a pro on the sustainability, which to use DRT instead of a bus in rural low traffic lines. Lucas Follianti, please, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. So this is Lucas Follianti of the routing company. Thank you, Sergei. I thought this was extremely insightful. And I think I agree with your conclusions. I think sort of real world deployments actually I think show that very well, that DRT I think is a very strong solution for low density areas, and that also especially the integration of DRT with traditional fixed line public transport creates the most value. Nevertheless, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about the methodology, specifically to the algorithms you applied, just because the technology that we have developed is based on scholars of MIT and TU Delft. And for instance, one service in Andorra that is operating and with our technology is operating with an average 9 passengers per vehicle operating hour. So quite significantly more than the examples you gave, which I understand obviously is not only about the algorithm and the technology, but also about the service design, where it operates, how much demand there is, how many vehicles you have. But nevertheless, if you could maybe just speak a little bit more onto that, this would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, you hit very on point here. I will start from a global overview. A lot of, if not the most, people use the simplest algorithm. That's just insert a new trip when it comes kind of optimally. The insertion heuristic, because those big and complex problems and computation time here actually skyrockets very quickly. We had, well, actually, in the Lolland case, for example, that's also what we used for the second case, for the Sjöbo. We actually used a different heuristic. Well, its name is ruin and recreate. We used a tool called JSprit. Maybe you know if you're in the topic. The graph hopper service, for example, is built upon it. So and what we optimizing is in this case is the total cost, operational cost, which takes into account cost of vehicles and driver time and vehicle drive time. And it also leads me to a second point regarding different optimization goals on operational level. First, yes, we can tune the algorithm to optimize different things, and it will produce rather different results. The second, yeah, we have kind of typically, I cannot think of a different example. People have restriction in like waiting time from the request, plus the restriction in maximum, basically maximum trip duration, maximum detour duration. That is also a flexible parameter that would affect the performance to some degree. Actually, I don't have it, the charts right now. I have them in the publication. But in our case, it was an effect, but not very large, in fact, allowing for a bigger detours in Lolland. And in fact, the DRT could handle the smaller, rather strict restrictions like 1.1 of the car time very well, with a relatively small increase for the operational costs. Yeah, but in overall, if we look at the literature around, there is a bit of a disconnect between people who study the service, the concept, and the people who study algorithms. There, you can find sophisticated tools that are focusing on optimizing algorithms. People who are into like evaluating the service are a bit they are happy to use the simple algorithm as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question, or else we walk through this last slides here? Okay. Then I would like to announce for the next webinar, which will be on demand in Europe, a comparison of several others trials with on-demand transport solutions in Europe. And it's Amelie Sundberg from WIA which will have it. And if you have other suggestions on other webinars or speakers, so please feel free to mail me these suggestions. And I also will make a punch for the översiktskurs services, a base course in service transports or on-demand transports. We had 1 week this year in early January, and it's now decided that we will have it next year also. It's week number 5 from 29th of January to 2nd of February in Lund, Sweden. And it will be a whole week, and find more information at dinkurs.se services 2024. So please feel free to give others who might be interested in this information, and you will also find information at kollektivtrafik.se. And for the last slide here, it's also an you can have a form here, an utvärderingsform. You can scan the QR code just with the mobile, and you will find a few questions about this webinar. And I will also wishing you a pleasant weekend as we soon become here. Thank you very much for today's listening, and thank you especially you, Sergei.
Yes, thank you all.